All right. Welcome back to our Wednesday evening Bible study here at Mayfield Drive Baptist Church. And we are continuing on with our study of church history. Except now we are looking at church history beyond the trail of blood. In other words, a short history of Baptists in America. Well, as short as I can make it, let's put it that way. So this is part number 1, and by way of introduction, there's a lot of material concerning the Baptists in America. It's noted that many Baptists left Europe because of persecution. The history of Baptists in America is also littered with persecution that they thought they had left behind. The way to freedom of worship in America is also bloodstained, as these early churches fought to have the freedom to carry out the Great Commission as they felt that God would have them to do. Now, I'm utilizing a history of the Baptist of the United States written by Albert Henry Newman, who was a professor of church history at McMaster University in Toronto, Canada. This book was copyrighted in 1894 and was published by the Christian Literature Company. Now let's look at the tie between European Baptist and American Baptist. It's essential that we understand this connection because it figures in greatly into the history of the American churches. Newman, in the introduction of this work, goes to great lengths to show the tie between the Americans, or between the Baptists in Europe and those in early America, later to be called the United States of America.
I could barely see it from here, so yeah, I didn't want everybody to think I was trying to make an eye chart. I should have handed out binoculars at the door.
All right, so in your notes, what I am quoting is inset. You know, the margins are a bit inset. So rather than put quotation marks around everything. All right, the Anabaptist movement of the 16th century had its roots in the evangelical parties of the Middle Ages, to which it owed its modes of thought, its type of Christian life, and its methods of work. To the peculiar circumstances of the time, it owed most of the features that differentiate it from the earlier movements. The term Anabaptist was applied indiscriminately to all who, dissenting from the dominant forms, dissenting, dissenting, from the dominant forms of Protestantism and from Roman Catholicism, insisted on setting up separate churches for the embodiment and the propagation of their views. To the dominant parties, Thomas Menzer, the mystical, mystical. Now, that word has an asterisk beside of it. I'm going to come back and define that in just a minute. Fanatic and socialistic agitator who never submitted to nor administered rebaptism, who persisted in baptizing infants, and who sought to set up the kingdom of Christ by carnal warfare. The scholarly, soundly scriptural Hubmaier, the intellectual, spiritual mystic Denek, and the chalistic, now I'll define that in just a moment, fanatics of minister, chiliistic. Yes, ma'am. CHILIS, or IASTIC. CHILIASTIC. Fanatics of Minster were all alike Anabaptist, and even the most Christ-like of these were treated as criminals of the deepest dye. Yeah, going back up to the first asterisk there, mystical. Mysticism is popularly known as becoming one with God or the absolute, but may refer to any kind of ecstasy or altered state of consciousness which is given a religious or spiritual meaning. So there we have the definition of mystical as it's used. All right, the next word, carnal, is pertaining to or characterized by the flesh or the body, its passions and appetites, sensual, carnal pleasures, not spiritual, merely human, temporal, worldly. And then the chiliistic, relating to or believing in Christian millennial-arianism. In other words,
1,000-year reign of Christ.
Right. They believed in the millennium. Okay. There was some excuse for the confusion, for this confusion in the fact that, and I highlighted this because it's very, very important, most of those to whom the epithet was applied denied the scriptural authorization of infant baptisms and made baptism on a profession of faith a condition of entering into their fellowship. In other words, they had to be immersed and scripturally baptized by a church before they would be accepted.
Amen.
But not all, as we have touched on before, not all that had the label Anabaptist attached to them were true Baptists, as we see here. All right, the beginning of the 16th century was a time of unrest and expectancy. A spirit of revolution was abroad. Enough of evangelical light and enough of the spirit of freedom had been diffused among the oppressed masses to ensure among them an enthusiastic reception for any movement that should give fair promise of relief from priestcraft and social amelioration. That's amelioration. Yes, amelioration means to improve social conditions. I tell you what, one thing about these 1800 writers, they sure can put stuff together. Yes, sir.
Social amelioration is still in practice today. There's actually in the Philippines, there is a social amelioration act that's law in the Philippines, was enacted in the late 70s, early 80s, and is still in effect and is widely used in the Philippines today, believe it or not. So this social amelioration, those words, when I typed them in to find out what that actually meant, it immediately brings up what is going on in the Philippines right now. It's something.
Very good. Very good.
So it's not just 1870s or 1800s stuff. This is modern.
Modern also.
Modern also.
Okay. Thank you. When Luther denounced indulgences and afterward went on a sailing, that didn't mean he got in a boat and sailed away. One after another, the corruption and errors of the Roman Catholic Church, those who had come under the influence of the evangelical movements of the earlier time, felt that now, at last, the day of deliverance had come and rallied to his, meaning Luther's, support. Luther's bold proclamation of the sufficiency and authority of the Scriptures, of the universal priesthood of believers, and the right of each individual Christian to interpret the Scriptures for himself, and his repudiation of, quote, whatever falls short of, is apart from, or goes beyond Christ, unquote, must have produced a strong impression on those who had been listening for such a mighty leader to voice their sentiments. They were just waiting for someone to come along and to start the ball rolling. It was natural that when Luther began to draw back in deference to the views of the civil rulers and from fear of disastrous revolution, the radical reformers that had taken him at his word should refuse to conform to his moderated scheme and should set themselves in opposition to what they considered a temporizing policy. And each one of these quotes, I put the page numbers that I've taken it from. So the reaction or the actions of Luther caused a backlash of violence. by some of the most radical of the Anabaptists. The rebellion engulfed most of Europe and even into Switzerland. The persecution of the true Anabaptists was great. Sometimes entire congregations migrated to other places to try and escape it. By 1530, nearly all of the Anabaptist leaders of the earlier time had been destroyed. Persecution had become so fierce and so general that apart from Moravia, there was scarcely a place of refuge. Moravia, Moravia. Moravia. You would ask that question, wouldn't you?
It's a historical region east of the Czech Republic.
All right, east of the Czech Republic.
It's in eastern Czech Republic.
Eastern Czech Republic, okay.
There's three historical Czechoslovakian lands: Moravia, Bohemia, and Czech Silesia.
Okay. I knew it was in that region somewhere, but I couldn't picture just exactly where it was. In other words, it was Eastern European, what we would call Eastern European now.
Yes.
All right, thank you. The question, scriptural baptism. The traditions, according to which Baptist churches, as distinct from congregations of Dutch Mennonites, existed in England and prior to 1609 seem to be unsupported by any evidence that the historian can accept. Now, in other words, what he's saying, they couldn't be absolutely sure. It is possible that some Welsh congregations of the ancient British type or some Lollard congregations practiced believers' baptism in the 16th century or earlier, but decisive evidence is wanting. In other words, what Newman is saying, that there is not enough written history to really say that that was indeed a fact. It seems that the Mennonites had a great deal of influence on the churches in England. When the question concerning baptism arose, some were sent to Holland to the Mennonites in order to receive scriptural baptism. Now, I have read where Newman has written several times on this matter, but I am still unclear as to whether this was scriptural baptism present in this whole affair. That's me talking. I just couldn't find where a reference was made to scriptural authority in baptism, which leads me to question all of their baptism. Was it really scriptural? I don't know. And I think that's what Newman is saying too. It wasn't possible to state that as a documented fact. Eventually, the persecution of the Baptists became so severe that most of them migrated to Holland, where there was freedom to worship as they pleased. There was still much debate as to whether infant baptism was scriptural or not. Some churches seem to have practiced it while others forbade it. Now, I'm going to have to correct myself in this statement here. I would like for you to scratch out this sentence that you have, starting with did not condone and believe in infant baptism. Scratch through that, if you would, please. And write this. Those churches refused to be a part of the Church of England. Those churches who refused to be a part of the Church of England were often called separatists. I did a little research on this, and I tell you, the understanding of what true Baptists were and are today.
Can you state that again, please?
Yes, sir. Those churches who refused to be part of the Church of England were often called separatists.
Until you had us correct that, when I was reading that part where it says they believe in infant baptism, I said, I got the answer is pedo-baptist. So.
Yes, that's another term.
Yeah.
Pedo-baptist.
You'll see that on down.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I just read that where it says believe in infant baptism.
Yes, infant baptism
Yeah.
was described as being pedo-baptists. Okay, thank you for making that change on the screen also. All right, about 1602, John Smith, the Jamaicans would say John Smythe, a Cambridge graduate and one of the most scholarly men of his time, gathered a separatist church at Gainsborough. Now, the use of that word separatist and what he did caused me to go back and re-examine the definition of the word separatist. So what he got together may not have been Baptist at all. They may have been adherents of the Church of England or maybe even Catholic. About 1606, pastor and congregation immigrated to Amsterdam and established themselves side by side with the older English congregation as the Second English Church at Amsterdam. In other words, they called themselves the Second English Church in Amsterdam. Newman writes that later Smith abandoned New Testament principles, and although he had renounced infant baptism, he became convinced that his baptism and the baptism of those with him in that, quote, Second English Church at Amsterdam was also invalid. You talk about confusing. He reinstituted baptism by immersion. But church authority in the matter is quite questionable. It seemed all they were concerned with was being immersed. And I've done a lot of reading in the background of this, and I have yet to see church authority being mentioned in connection with baptism.
Joe,
Yes.
also, Christian writes about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you really want to throw some hairs up, do what I did. One of the first, it was that first few months I was here, and on our sign I put, John Smythe did not establish the first Baptist church. Jesus Christ did. And I was getting telephone calls.
Yeah.
John Smythe wasn't even Baptist.
I know. But I was getting them phone calls, like, oh.
But this is actually a different, I think, as far as I can determine, a different John Smythe. He lived earlier than the one
Yeah.
that was later in America. I think. Don't quote me on that completely. All right. He reinstituted baptism by immersion, but church authority in the matter was quite questionable. Smith justified his act in instituting baptism anew on grounds entirely satisfactory to modern Baptists. Now, that's Newman's statement. He claimed that he and his followers, now follow along closely, had just as much right to, quote unquote, baptize themselves as his opponents had to, quote, to set up a true church. You see what I mean? There is no mention of church authority. For a true church, he proceeds, quote, may be erected, which is the most noble ordinance of the New Testament, then much more baptism. If they must recover them, men must begin so to do. And then two men joining together may make a church, unquote. Oh, really? You thoroughly confused now? He maintained that, quote, any man raised up after the apostasy of Antichrist in the recovering of the church by baptism, unquote, may, quote again, administer it upon himself in communion with others, unquote. You see how ridiculous that it becomes? Well, we don't have scriptural baptism, but I'm going to baptize Jamie, and then he's going to baptize me, and we're okay. That's what's going on.
Why don't we just grab some soap while we're at it?
Amen. the necessity for this